Just briefly summarizing another nice paper which actually found a continuous record from the Eastern African region, where we have focused a lot when it comes to the evolution of our ancestors and ourselves and the diaspora out of Africa and so on. So this focuses mostly on the last 635,000 years or so, and it's gathered from this Bara, I think it's called, station here, which is put in the context of the various lakes and seas. So here's the Indian Ocean, Persian Gulf, Red Sea, Mediterranean Sea, and so on. And there we are with the various other sites. So obviously we have looked at evidences from archaeological and other evidences from various sites, and model simulations of the last several marine isotopic stages to make several conclusions along the way. This one is special just in terms of a continuous record from the so-called cradle of human evolution in East Africa. You can see in a zoomed in section where it sits. This is called a playa lake, which is basically water collecting in a recess in the ground, which is very appears and disappears, so it's not a continuous lake, but nonetheless there is a paleo drilling program which provided enough of a long time series to look at potassium, zirconium, potassium, titanium kind of signatures of climate change along the way. So I won't go into the technical details, which are always interesting, but that's not the goal of this course on climate and human evolution. But if you want, you can always follow up. So looking at the CHP sediment types, they have blue, green, and red, brown. In our context, it's basically to look at the time scales over which they flip-flop, and then look at the evidence of PC2 of the color of reflectance in the sediment. So they basically split the whole period into type 1 and type 2 using this empirical orthogonal function approach to identify the points at which transitions happen, and you can see that analysis here. They're called change points. So they identify various environmental episodes along the way using the potassium zirconium evidences to look at the African humid period where the rainfalls tend to be higher, so 1100 to about 1190 millimeter per year with some uncertainty, and the modern period you are comparing against is at 920 millimeter per year over the site that we are looking at. So that divides it into humid and arid periods here, and we'll come back to this a little bit later on as well. And the idea is that the environmental variability along the way has had key impacts on the evolution of our species as well as migration out of Africa. This is again the terminology we used before called environmental determinism. So you are taking archaeological and other evidences to see where changes happened in our evolution and migrations, and try to nail it down to environmental or climate changes, which is not something that anthropologists always would agree with, for example. Nonetheless, in the context of this paper, that's what we will do. They also look at the changes in the orbital forcing, because these are natural climate variabilities going back that far. So precession forcing and eccentricity forcing, and obviously there is a general agreement that when you have higher insolation you have humid period, when you have lower insolations you end up with drier periods over the region that we want to study. There's a detailed caption here that obviously I'm not reading. Okay, but let's jump to this nice detailed figure which looks at phases in human origins. So you are looking at from archaic human groups, and phase 1 transition going to separation of modern human ancestors. So just pay attention to the changes in the sediments, which are an indication of the switches from humid periods to dry periods, and there is also arid period. There's also a so-called wet period where you are actually much higher than the general humid period. And the idea is that the dry period, so here you can see a great dip and a persistence of the drier arid period for a while, and we will see in terms of human evolutions and various evolutions of technologies and sharing and cultural mixes, we see some coincident changes as well. So separation of modern humans, so you are looking here at in terms of archaeological finds, what we have discussed before, the Acheulean or East African periods. This continuous time series then allows us to separate that into from archaic human groups into separation of modern human ancestors, and then there is a bit of uncertainty because this is relatively stable, even though there is one change point identified here as 6. So you can track those as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and so on. So look at the jump here in terms of the behavioral transitions combined with the archaeological finds. So these are obviously kind of a statistical analysis and then looking for environmental determinism in terms of climate drivers. So you are looking at the various tool types that we have discussed before. So East Africa, Homo kibish, and you have various little changes happening along the way in terms of humid and wet periods, or arid and humid periods, wet and dry periods, or humid and arid periods. So Levant and Saudi Arabia, Mislia 1, Herto, Sukul, and Kafse and Al-Wusta, so you can follow up all these things. So here is human diversity happening in high, more variable climate period. So you can see the jumping out in and out of the hydroclimate band shown here, transitioning between humid and arid. And again, the basic idea is that the higher variability in climate in terms of transitioning between humid and arid had notable impacts on various tool building and cultural exchanges. So you're looking here at the Middle Stone Age and the Late Stone Age. So the resolution is around 50 kilometers in terms of the depth of this is cultural innovation, so expansion of the cultural communities. Long distance raw material greater than 166 kilometers here. Composite cultural capacity starting in here. Complementary cultural capacity and national cultural capacity. So you can see that there is an attempt to connect these, how societal complexities, national identities, etc. evolved based on resource limitations, resource sharing, cultural exchanges, cultural complementary capacities, and so on. We have discussed these before in terms of whether there were networks where technologies were exchanged, and so on and so forth. So here are the African wet periods identified along the way. So even in the arid band down here, you have jumps into the wet periods and back. So this is where the variability is very high, and the general conclusions are that Pleistocene climate variability has had a huge impact on human evolution and cultural evolution, social complexification along the way. To read some of the text from the discussion, evidence of more varied toolkits, long distance transport, and symbolism appear during periods of rapid environmental perturbation, demonstrating more developed cultural capabilities among Middle Stone Age hominins. Such innovations emerge in situ but subsequently equip populations to disperse into novel environments. Both technological and social innovations could have buffered early Homo sapiens from the impacts of severe environmental changes. So the adaptation capacity and adaptability that we talked about, genetic versus cultural, behavioral, and so on, play into these narratives, but again you have to buy the idea of environmental determinism before you can accept these correlated combination of evidences from archaeological and other two environmental signatures. Some populations of Homo sapiens were able to disperse beyond Africa before 60 kiloyears, although it is not currently possible to identify their distinct geographical origins. Several pronounced wet phases at Chubara during the episode 7 to 9 align with the humid pulses in northeastern Africa and the Mediterranean, perhaps opening favorable migration routes out of Africa on a roughly north-south axis along the East African rift system and into the Levant. One possibility is that early dispersals involved populations dispersing in line with expansions or shifts of suitable habitats. This is the Axel Timmerman kind of hypothesis that suitable habitat indices can be used to conclude about expansions and migrations and diaspora. As cultural innovations accumulated during episode 7 to 9, however, they provided Homo sapiens populations with the means to expand beyond their native habitat. So do you go out of your habitat because there is a need, resource limitation, or you explore because you have already enough to be adventurous, with this expansion ultimately leading to global dispersal of modern humans? So there are a lot of assumptions and conclusions made here. In summary, the results from CHP core records suggest that shifting of environmental conditions during the past 620 kiloyears would have played a major role in human biological and cultural evolution. This shaped adaptations and provided environmental opportunities, facilitating modern human dispersal out of Africa. So you can read the details, but again, you can follow up with all the other things we have discussed in terms of just how key player climate perturbations are in these behavioral, cultural, societal changes and adaptations to newer habitats or adventurisms along the way, evolution of national identities versus exchanges on broader scales, exchanges of technology and cultures and maybe languages and so on and so forth. So it's just interesting because it's a new climate record that puts a bit more detail on the transient changes along the way, similar to the modeling exercise of Axel Timmerman and his group. Okay.